When a poor black lottery seller reaches for a violin during a rich kid's street concert, they laugh. But seconds later, every single one of them goes silent. Because what they just heard, no one could believe came from a man like him. This is not just a story about music. It's about second chances, forgotten genius, and the sound that healed an entire city. Stick with us until the end, and you'll never look at a stranger the same way again. Because sometimes, the soul you ignore holds the echo you're missing in your own. It was just past 3:30 p.m. on a Friday when the city began to hum with its usual restless rhythm. The sun cast long shadows between the high rises, bathing the pavement in golden streaks of warmth, but none of it reached the corner near 12th and Braxton. That little square of sidewalk was almost always in the shade, forgotten, like the man who sat there nearly every afternoon. Jerry Cole had claimed that spot for the past 2 years, just beneath the flickering no loitering sign that nobody enforced. His plastic chair squeaked under his weight as he shifted, pulling a stack of neatly organized scratch-off lottery tickets from a worn-out messenger bag. The bag had once been brown leather. Now it was closer to gray, softened by years of sun, rain, and indifference. Jerry was a tall black man with a frame that used to be strong, but had thinned over time. His hands, though calloused, moved with deliberate care as he set out the tickets on a cardboard display marked with the words "Lucky Strikes, $2 each." His faded green windbreaker hung loosely on his frame, zipped halfway over a checkered shirt that had seen better decades. The baseball cap shielding his silver-speckled curls read San Francisco, 1992, and sat slightly tilted, as though it, too, was tired. People passed him by in waves. Office workers rushing with Bluetooth earpieces, students with earbuds, tourists with frappuccinos. A few glanced at him. Fewer still stopped. Most ignored him altogether, as if he were a statue that had always been there. Some might have guessed he was homeless. Others might have thought he was just a street hustler. No one cared enough to ask. But Jerry didn't seem to mind. His eyes, deep-set and tired, held something different, like they were always watching a movie only he could see. He had the patience of someone who had once waited on bigger things. "Good afternoon, sir. Try your luck," he said softly, offering a smile to a middle-aged man in a navy suit. The man barely slowed, pretending to check his phone as he breezed past. "Ma'am? Just $2. Today might be your day," he called to a young woman with a yoga mat strapped to her back. She shook her head without looking. "Thought so," Jerry mumbled to himself with a half-smile. He wasn't bitter. He had seen too much in life to expect kindness from everyone. Still, it hurt a little less when he at least tried. Occasionally, a kind soul would stop, often elderly folks, immigrants, or kids without much money themselves. Some gave him $1 just because. Others bought a ticket, scratched it right there, and shared a chuckle whether they won or not. Jerry had a way of making people feel calm, even if they didn't notice it at the time. By 4 p.m., the sounds of the city began to shift. A bass line thudded from a Bluetooth speaker. A crowd of teenagers, 6 of them, all white, all dressed like they just stepped out of a music video, began setting up near the center of the plaza, about 30 feet from Jerry's corner. They called themselves the Gilded Strings, and they were local social media darlings. Their gimmick was mixing classical instruments with modern beats, violin riffs over trap drums, Beethoven meets EDM. They drew a crowd every time. Not just because they were good, but because they were flashy. Blake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, wore a red hoodie with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms inked with music notes. His hair was bleached blonde, styled in loose curls. He slung his electric violin onto his back like a rock star's guitar, barking orders to his crew while chewing gum like he owned the square. "Jade, pull the beat pads closer. Cameron, check the mic levels. We go live in 10. They weren't unkind, per se. Just young. Loud. Entitled in a way only kids raised on compliments and free Wi-Fi could be. As they unpacked speakers and mic stands, Jerry watched quietly from his spot. His hands folded, resting on his lap, his eyes drawn, not to the crowd gathering, but to the violin case sitting by Blake's feet. For a long time, he didn't move. Just stared at it. The way someone might stare at an old photograph that stirs up too many ghosts to speak about. His right hand twitched slightly. The music started. A thumping beat looped in the background as Blake closed his eyes and began to play. The notes were sharp, fast, impressive in technique, but lacked soul. Jerry tilted his head. He wasn't judging. He was listening. Really listening. After 20 minutes, the group took a break, basking in applause. Jade handed Blake a bottle of water. Someone from the crowd shouted, "Encore." "Give us a sec," Guys. Blake grinned, soaking in the attention. He wiped his brow and walked toward the edge of the group to stretch his arms. He hadn't even noticed Jerry watching. But Jerry stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, like waking from a dream. He took a few steps forward, cane in one hand, the other slightly reaching. It was as if the violin was calling him. "Excuse me, young man," Jerry said politely, voice calm. "May I hold that violin for a moment?" Blake turned, confused, then smirked. "Wait, what?" he asked, looking Jerry up and down. "You want to hold my violin?" "Yes," Jerry said simply, eyes not blinking. Laughter rippled through Blake's crew. Jade raised an eyebrow. Cameron nudged another bandmate. A few people from the crowd began to gather again, sensing drama. "You'll get this on video," someone whispered behind them. Blake, ever the showman, grinned wider. "Tell you what, Pops. If you can hold it without dropping it, I'll let you play a note or two. Sound fair?" More chuckles. A few phones came out. Jerry nodded. Blake reached down, unclipped the violin, and held it out like a trophy he didn't expect the old man to understand. Jerry's hands reached forward. The moment his fingers wrapped around the neck of the instrument, something changed. He didn't grip it like someone curious. He held it like someone reuniting with something sacred. The violin looked different in his hands. More at home. Natural. His left hand adjusted the fine tuners almost without looking. His right hand lifted the bow, testing the tension with an instinctive flick. The laughter faded. "What the hell?" Cameron muttered. Blake's smirk slept. Jerry took one small breath, rolled his shoulders back, and brought the violin to his chin. He hadn't played in years. But some things, some loves, don't rust. They wait. In silence. In patience. And when he drew the bow across the strings, a sound emerged that no one expected. Not even Jerry. The first note wasn't loud, but it carried. It wasn't flashy or fast, like Blake's earlier performance. It was warm. Deep. It curled into the air like smoke and held itself there, shimmering with emotion no one had asked for, but now couldn't turn away from. Jerry stood still, the violin tucked under his chin, the bow moving with practiced restraint, not force. His left hand hovered over the fingerboard, dancing with precision so natural it felt like breathing. The sound was unlike anything that had echoed through that plaza before. It had weight, history, grief, power. The notes didn't beg for attention. They demanded reverence. The audience had started to giggle, expecting a joke, something to post on social media with laughing emojis and ironic hashtags. But now their phones were trembling in their hands. "What? Is he playing?" someone whispered. No one answered. Blake stood with his arms crossed, jaw slightly clenched. At first, he thought it was beginner's luck. A fluke. But Jerry didn't stop at one note. He played on, fluidly, into something that sounded part jazz, part blues, part something else entirely. The structure of the melody was unfamiliar, yet it wrapped around you like an old story you'd somehow forgotten. It wasn't a song. It was a testimony. From a distance, the plaza remained its usual chaotic self. Buses groaned, a delivery bike zipped by, someone's phone rang. But within the bubble forming around Jerry, time slowed. He wasn't just playing. He was speaking through the strings. Blake looked down at the bow Jerry was using, his bow, and suddenly felt insignificant. For all the equipment, the brand name gear, the YouTube subscribers, there was something Jerry had that none of them did. Soul. Jade, the keyboardist, leaned in toward Blake. "Yo, are you hearing this?" "Yeah," Blake muttered, his arms now enfolded. "I'm hearing it." Jerry's eyes remained closed. His head moved slightly with the phrasing, like he was listening to the music as it came, not just producing it. His body swayed gently, but his feet didn't shift. They were planted, solid. As if for the first time in years, he had finally found ground again. And still, the crowd grew. What had started as 30 people became 50, then 100. People walking down Braxton Street turned at the sound. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks. Even a police officer on bike patrol slowed down, watching the man who didn't look like anyone special coax magic out of maple and string. A little boy sitting on his father's shoulders clapped his hands without understanding why he was moved. An elderly woman pressed her hand to her chest and whispered something about Miles Davis. A college student who'd been filming for fun found herself lowering the phone, eyes brimming with tears. No one knew what they were listening to, but everyone felt it. Then, without warning, Jerry's fingers shifted position, and the tempo changed. The sound sharpened, not violently, but with urgency. What had started as sorrow became resistance. The bow struck with more confidence. The runs became faster, the dynamics more complex. The music now carried tension, a struggle, a story of fight and fall, of losing something sacred, of clawing toward redemption. Blake took a single step forward. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was reflex. Or maybe, deep down, he was confronting something inside himself that he didn't know existed. Because in this moment, he wasn't the star. He was a student. Jerry's final phrase wasn't grand. It didn't end with a flourish or a showman's bow. It ended the way people close a letter to someone they still love but can no longer speak to, with ache. The last note hovered, then faded. Silence. Not polite silence. Sacred silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, a single clap, followed by another, and then an eruption. Applause like a standing ovation, though no one had rehearsed it. Some cheered. Others just stood with their mouths open. Several people recorded, but more simply watched, aware they'd just witnessed something too honest to dilute. Jerry slowly lowered the violin, hands steady. His eyes opened, and he blinked like someone returning from a dream. Blake stepped forward, slowly, awkwardly. Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, barely audible over the fading applause. Jerry looked at him for a long second. Then he tilted his head and gave a tired smile. "I didn't learn it," he said. "I lived it." A quiet gasp rippled through a group of girls nearby. Blake nodded, hands now shoved into his hoodie pockets. That was insane." Jerry handed the violin back, gently. "Thank you for letting me hold it." "You didn't just hold it, sir," Jade said, stepping up beside Blake. Her voice carried awe. "You owned it." Jerry gave a nod of appreciation but said nothing more. He walked slowly back to his chair on the corner. The same squeaky plastic seat. The same stack of lottery tickets. But he didn't sit. Instead, he stood, staring at the violin in Blake's hands from across the distance. "You play well," Jerry finally said. "But you play like you want to be noticed." Blake frowned. "Isn't that the point? I mean, we're performers. Being noticed isn't the same as being felt," Jerry replied. "In music, real music, isn't about proving. It's about remembering." The words hung in the air like echoes from the strings. A young woman in a business suit stepped out of the crowd and walked directly up to Jerry. Her face was pale, eyes wide. "Excuse me, sir. I know this sounds crazy, but were you ever in the San Francisco Philharmonic?" Jerry looked at her. Quiet. "Yes," he said softly. "A long time ago." The crowd stirred again. "You're Jeremiah Cole," she said. "My mom had a vinyl recording. I remember your solo on Dvorak. She used to play it every Sunday morning." He nodded, a bit stunned. "You were incredible," she whispered. "You still are." He tried to smile, but his lips quivered. Someone from the local news station, who had arrived halfway through the performance to cover a fluff story on young street talent, was now scrambling to reframe their segment. Their camera zoomed in on Jerry as the reporter mouthed something like, "Get his name." But Jerry didn't care about the cameras, or the attention, or the rediscovery. He looked down at his own hands, those same hands that had once held bows worth thousands, that had graced stages across Europe and Asia, and he breathed in deeply. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. Not as a relic, not as a burden, but as a man who still had music inside him. Behind him, a homeless man with a shopping cart full of cans tapped him on the shoulder. "Brother," he said with awe, "you made me remember something I didn't even know I lost." Jerry looked him in the eye and said softly, "Me too." The moment was real, pure. It would later be clipped, filtered, and posted online 1,000 times with hashtags like #ViolinMan, #JerichoReturns, and #TheRealTalent. It would hit millions of views before midnight. Some would call it a comeback. Others would say it was a miracle. But in that plaza, in that sacred silence between note and memory, it wasn't about fame or resurrection. It was just a man and a violin, and a truth that could no longer be ignored. By the next afternoon, the plaza was buzzing long before the instruments came out. Word had spread like wildfire. An old black man, a lottery ticket seller, had picked up a violin and played something so powerful it stopped a privileged street performance cold. The viral videos were everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, even YouTube compilations. Jerry Cole's name was trending in small corners of music forums, and though many didn't know exactly who he was yet, they knew what they had felt. But while the crowd was intrigued, the young musicians were unsettled. Blake hadn't said much since yesterday's performance. He'd spent the night watching that video of Jerry over and over, each time hoping the magic would fade, that the emotion he'd felt in that moment was exaggerated, imagined. But it wasn't. Every time the bow moved across the strings, it tore something loose in Blake. Not just jealousy, not just embarrassment, but truth. A truth he'd spent years glossing over with polished performances and sleek production. Now, as he unpacked the violin again near the stone bench in the plaza center, he glanced sideways. Jerry was there. Same seat, same windbreaker, same careful display of lottery tickets. But something had changed. People were stopping. Not just for tickets, but to talk. To shake Jerry's hand. To ask about his past, his music. Someone brought him a coffee. Another offered to buy him a new chair. One woman even offered to start a GoFundMe, which he politely declined. It wasn't fame Jerry was receiving. It was recognition. And for Blake, that stung deeper than a public humiliation. Because he had spent years crafting his sound, branding himself, chasing virality, only for a man with no mic, no amp, no filter, to steal the spotlight with one touch of a bell. Blake's crew was split. Jade, ever the empath, had watched Jerry's performance in near tears. She had since started following his name online and even found an old photo of him from the 1980s, performing at the Berlin Philharmonie. "Do you know how hard it is to get in there?" she whispered, scrolling on her phone. This guy wasn't just good. He was elite. Cameron, the drummer, wasn't so sure. Yeah, but come on. That was a moment. Doesn't mean he still has it. I mean, anyone can get lucky once, right? Blake didn't respond. He just tuned his violin a little more aggressively than usual. The crowd was forming again, easily double what it had been the day before. Everyone had their phones out now. Not for Blake, but in anticipation of Jerry. "Think he'll play again?" someone whispered near the front. "I heard he used to tour internationally." Someone said he played for Reagan's inauguration. The whispers grew. So did the tension. By the time Blake stepped forward and adjusted his mic, the crowd was buzzing with the kind of electric expectation that no one had ever directed at him before. He cleared his throat. We appreciate all the support. Looks like we're going viral, right?" he said, trying to chuckle. "But let's be real. Y'all came to see a show. So we're going to give you one." Weak applause. Blake paused, looked over at Jerry, and something shifted. A flicker of defensiveness, of pride twisted by insecurity. He picked up his violin and raised his voice. "Yesterday, we had a surprise guest. A very talented one," he said, forcing a smile. "But some people think that moment makes everything we've built here meaningless." A few in the crowd murmured. Jade looked up, concerned. "So," Blake continued, "if he's open to it, I'd like to invite Mr. Cole up again." Jerry didn't move. Blake's grin sharpened. "Maybe this time, we turn it into a friendly challenge." The plaza fell quiet. The energy turned fast, from admiration to spectacle. Jade stepped forward, whispering harshly, "Blake, what the hell are you doing?" "I just want to play," he said, "and let people decide." "This isn't a rap battle," Jade shot back. "He's not here to prove anything." But Blake was already holding the violin out again, arms extended toward Jerry across the plaza like a dare in disguise. "Come on, Mr. Cole," Blake said louder now. "One song each. We let the crowd vote." "Sound fair?" Gasps rippled. This wasn't a tribute anymore. It was a trap. The plaza turned toward Jerry, who still hadn't stood. His hands rested on his lap, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose. He said nothing as he walked, just stepped off the sidewalk, past his plastic chair, and into the open ring of bodies forming the stage. Jerry stopped in front of Blake, who offered the violin once more. But Jerry didn't take it. Instead, he looked Blake in the eyes and asked, "What exactly are you challenging?" Blake faltered. I just thought people should hear more. Compare. Get inspired." Jerry nodded once. "And who's supposed to be inspired? You or them?" The question landed like a slap. Not angry, just accurate. But Jerry, always calm, finally took the violin. He stepped aside, motioning to Blake. "You first." There it was. The reversal. Blake, caught in his own theater, couldn't back out now. He adjusted the mic, raised his chin, and launched into his set. He played flawlessly, technically sound, rhythmically tight. It was the same high-energy mashup he'd rehearsed for weeks, a fusion of Vivaldi and trap beats, cutting edge and Gen Z cool. The crowd cheered, mostly from habit. But something was missing. It was exciting, but not moving. Fast, but not deep. By the time Blake finished, the applause came with less fervor than the day before. There were cheers, but not all. Then Jerry stepped forward. No mic, no effects, just the violin and bow. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain. He just played. And from the first note, just like yesterday, it was no longer a performance. It was a memory poured into melody. This time, it wasn't sorrow. It was resolve. Fire. A journey from silence into purpose. He played something no one had ever heard before, a melody that sounded like someone waking from a lifetime of sleep, finally remembering their name. His fingers flew across the strings, not with youthful arrogance, but with absolute command. Every slide, every double stop, every harmonic felt earned, not shown off. The crowd forgot to breathe. The wind died again. Even the birds above seemed to hush. And when he finished, again, with a soft final note that drifted into the plaza like dust, the silence returned. Then came the ovation. But this time, it wasn't claps or screams. It was tears. A mother near the back pulled her child into her chest. A man in a business suit wiped his face. Jade covered her mouth and cried quietly. And Blake? He just stood there, violin in hand, as if seeing it for the first time. Jerry handed the instrument back without a word and returned to his corner. The crowd didn't follow. They just stood, changed, because what they had just witnessed was no challenge. It was a reminder that greatness doesn't come with youth, popularity, or production. It comes from pain, from silence, from truth. And sometimes, truth sounds like a violin in the hands of a man the world forgot. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind, restless just moments ago, seemed to pause, as if nature itself refused to interrupt what had just happened. The plaza, once filled with idle chatter, caffeine-fueled tourists, and the beat of background pop music, was now held hostage by a silence far louder than applause. And it all began with just one note. That single note from Jerry Cole's violin, a sound that slipped through space like it had always belonged there, had changed something. Not just in the air, but inside the people who heard it. The sound had risen from strings and silence and years of being overlooked. It was textured with memory, soaked in dignity, and infused with something raw that no camera filter could replicate: truth. A mother in the crowd hugged her daughter tightly, whispering nothing but holding on like the sound might somehow pass through her bones into the girl's heart. A street food vendor leaned against his cart, arms crossed, blinking fast like he'd just remembered the face of someone he'd lost. Nearby, a German tourist who hadn't understood a single word being said since he'd arrived in the country stood frozen, eyes glassy. For those few minutes, nobody cared about race, class, likes, or who had the better violin. They weren't looking at Jerry's shoes or his old coat or the creases on his hands. They weren't thinking about his age or his corner seat or the worn lottery sign behind him. They were just listening. Because somehow, every person in that plaza, young or old, black or white, rich or poor, felt as if the music was telling their story. And yet, they all knew the story belonged to him. Blake stood with his violin tucked under one arm like a forgotten accessory. Sweat lined his temple, but he wasn't hot. He was humbled. His fingers, so confident a moment ago, now trembled slightly, not from exhaustion but from realization. He wasn't just outplayed. He was outlived. Jade stepped beside him slowly, not to say anything, just to be there. She could feel the tremor in the crowd, a current running through their collective silence. For the first time, she understood what it meant when people say, "I was there when it happened." Because this wasn't a street show anymore. This was history in motion. Jerry stood still after finishing. His head remained bowed slightly, the violin still resting at his neck like a relic, a cross, a memory. His bow hand lowered last, almost ceremoniously. He hadn't moved much during the performance, but he'd journeyed farther than any of them could imagine. Someone at the back started clapping. Then another, and another. The sound built slowly, not into a roar, but into something more reverent. Applause that respected, not applauded. A collective nod to the kind of artistry that didn't beg to be noticed because it had already been earned. A little boy near the fountain turned to his dad and asked, "Why did that make me feel like crying?" His father bent down, eyes moist. "Because it was real, buddy. That's what real sounds like." Jerry finally lifted his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His face carried something more powerful than joy. It carried peace. The kind of peace that only comes when a man has nothing left to prove, yet still proves everything anyway. A woman in a gray blazer stepped forward, phone still in hand, but now pointed down, forgotten. "Sir, what's your name?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then answered, "Jeremiah Cole." It hit him like lightning. A few older heads turned fast. A gasp escaped a man near the left bench. "Wait, the Jeremiah Cole?" someone said aloud. A teenager turned to their parent. "Who's that?" The parent didn't answer immediately. Then, he was one of the best violinists in America. Maybe the world. I saw him when I was a kid. Boston Symphony, 1991. I never forgot it. More murmurs. San Francisco Philharmonic. He was their concertmaster. Didn't he disappear? I thought he was dead. Jerry remained quiet through it all. But the tide had already turned. The people in the plaza, who had once walked past him like he was nothing more than background noise, now watched him as if he'd just risen from legend. Some looked ashamed. Others looked grateful. A few looked changed. And then a reporter showed up. Of course. It was bound to happen. Viral stories, street miracles, they spread like wildfire in a world that craved authenticity more than ever. The reporter, a young woman with curly hair and an oversized tote bag filled with camera gear, squeezed through the gathering crowd, flanked by a cameraman. "Mr. Cole," she said, breathless, "we're with Channel 6. Would you be willing to talk about what just happened? About your story?" Jerry looked at her. His eyes didn't show resentment, just the kind of weariness that comes from being asked the same question in different ways by people who never listened the first time. "I've already told my story," he said, motioning to the violin in his hand. The cameraman, still filming, zoomed in slowly, as if to capture every wrinkle on Jerry's face like proof of a hard life lived honestly. The reporter smiled, trying to remain composed. "Would you be willing to play again for our viewers at home?" Jerry paused, looked down at the instrument, then up at the crowd. Some still had phones aimed at him. Others simply stood, waiting, no longer for entertainment, but for guidance. "No," he said finally. The reporter blinked. "No, I don't play for clicks," he said calmly. "I play for truth. And truth doesn't repeat on demand." The cameraman turned the camera off. There was no anger, no defiance, just clarity. That line would be quoted on Reddit threads, turned into Instagram captions, painted in murals. But Jerry didn't care. He didn't need to go viral. He already had a voice. He already had a legacy. And now, he had something more powerful than fame. Witnesses. As the crowd began to murmur, slowly dispersing in soft steps and thoughtful whispers, a girl about 16 years old walked up to Jerry. She wore oversized headphones around her neck and held a sketchbook in her arms. She said nothing, just opened the sketchbook to a pencil drawing she'd done of Jerry playing the violin. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Jerry looked at it, eyes softening. "That's beautiful," he said, brushing his finger lightly over the page. "So is your music," she whispered. "Thank you." She handed him the drawing. He started to protest, but she had already walked away. Blake approached slowly, violin in hand. His posture was different now, no longer puffed up, but open, almost uncertain. "I'm sorry," he said. Jerry looked at him, but didn't interrupt. "I thought I was helping," Blake continued. "Challenging you, giving you a stage. But you never needed that, did you?" Jerry gave a gentle smile. "No, son. I didn't need your stage. I just needed to remember who I was." He handed Blake the violin back and said, "Now you get to decide who you want to be." The weight of that moment hit harder than anything Blake had ever rehearsed. Because in that quiet square, surrounded by nothing more than concrete, old bricks, and open sky, a man they all had ignored had given them something their fancy schools, expensive gear, and fast fame never could. Meaning. And meaning, when played from the soul, freezes the whole world, if only for a note. It wasn't until hours later that the plaza remembered how to breathe. Even after Jerry quietly stepped away, folding into his corner like a shadow returning to its outline, no one really left. The energy was still too thick, too charged, like the space itself refused to let the moment slip by without sinking into the bricks and air. People stood around in small circles, whispering, replaying the sounds in their minds. Some tried to describe it. Others just couldn't. "He made the violin sound like it was singing," said an elderly woman sitting on the stone bench near the bakery window. "No," her granddaughter replied. "Like it was crying." Over by the coffee cart, the barista who normally played loud trap music through a speaker had turned it off. He leaned on the counter, quietly watching Jerry from a distance. "I've had musicians play out here for years," he muttered. "But that wasn't music. That was church." Up in one of the nearby apartments, a middle-aged man in a wheelchair wiped his eyes as he stared at the square from behind his windowpane. He didn't know the man's name yet, But he'd heard the violin through the open balcony, and it had made him stand up in his mind. It wasn't long before the ripple reached farther than the plaza. By the next morning, the video had passed 1.4 million views on TikTok. Another clip on Instagram had 720,000 likes. Someone created a hashtag #ViolinMan of Braxton. A Twitter thread popped up detailing Jerry's past career with grainy black and white photos of him standing in tuxedo with world-class conductors. And suddenly, the man who sold $2 scratch-off tickets by the flickering street sign had become a mystery the world wanted to solve. But Jerry? He returned the next day, same time, same spot. No fanfare. No entourage. He didn't even bring the violin. He just sat down, laid out his stack of lottery tickets, and greeted passers-by like he always had. "Good afternoon, sir. Try your luck." His voice was warm, soft, like nothing had changed. But everything had. Now, people stopped, not because they wanted to buy a ticket, but because they wanted to see him, to look him in the eye and thank him. Some brought coffee. Others brought stories, how they'd quit music and now wanted to play again, how their grandfather used to perform Bach before his hands gave out, how they once stood on stage but never found their sound. A college student brought him a violin case with new strings and said, "For when you're ready again." Jerry smiled politely, but gently pushed it back. "I don't need more violins," he said. "I just needed to hear myself again." Back in the plaza, the space felt different. People weren't just walking through it now. They were listening to it. Blake, for his part, hadn't touched his violin since the challenge. Not because he was angry, but because he was humbled. For 3 days, he walked through that same plaza, watching Jerry return, doing nothing more than sitting, smiling, and asking if people wanted to try their luck. And each day, Blake watched a small line form. Not a line for lottery tickets, but for conversation, for wisdom, for quiet. On day 4, Blake approached with no violin in hand. "Mr. Cole," he said softly, "do you have a minute?" Jerry looked up, and for the first time, there was a slight smile behind those eyes. "For you, son? I got a few." They sat together, side by side. Two musicians from two different worlds, bound now by something that no stage could buy. "I've been playing music all my life," Blake said, staring at his shoes. "But I don't think I've ever made anyone feel the way you did with that one piece." Jerry leaned back in his creaky plastic chair and let out a low breath, as if measuring his next words carefully. "Blake," he said, "there's a difference between playing music and letting music play you." Blake looked up, confused. "You can learn all the scales," Jerry continued. "Perfect your technique. Wear the fanciest clothes. Use the finest bow. But none of that matters if you're not connected to something bigger than yourself." "What is that something?" Blake asked. "Pain," Jerry said. "Love. Loss. Faith. Truth." Blake's throat tightened. Jerry went on. "I didn't play like that because I practiced. I played like that because I've lost everything. And music is the only way I could remember it without dying inside. Silence. The kind that holds." Then Jerry turned and asked, "Why do you play, Blake?" Blake didn't answer right away. "I thought I played to be heard," he finally admitted. "To get seen. To be respected." Jerry nodded. "That's a start, but not an ending." They sat in silence again. Just then, a young girl around 8 years old walked up, holding a paper in her hand. Her mother stood a few steps behind, watching gently. "Are you the man who played the sad music?" the girl asked. Jerry smiled. "That depends. Did it make you sad?" The girl shook her head. "No. It made me feel safe." She handed him the drawing, a crayon sketch of a man with gray hair holding a violin under yellow streetlights. All around him, stick figures smiled. Jerry's eyes blinked slow. "Thank you," he whispered. The mother nodded at him and mouthed, "Thank you for being here." They walked away. Blake turned to Jerry and said, "That's what you meant, isn't it? That's the something bigger." Jerry didn't reply. He didn't need to. That evening, when Jerry left the plaza, something was waiting for him at the base of his chair. It was a small wooden box. Inside, a handwritten note. "You don't know me, but you reminded me of my father. He played violin too. I lost him before I could hear him play. Thank you for giving me back a sound I never had. Please accept this gift. I made it myself. Luca." Inside the box, a hand-carved mute for a violin, shaped like a dove. Jerry touched it gently, then closed the box and pressed it against his chest. The crowd was gone, but in that moment, he realized something. He hadn't just played music for them. He had given them permission to remember, to feel, to grieve, to hope. And in doing so, the man who had spent years forgotten had made a city remember how to listen again. Not to noise, not to fame, but to truth, in its most fragile, most powerful form. A note that never fades. The whispers had started turning into facts. People no longer asked, "Who is he?" They were now asking, "Is it really him?" By the end of the week, Jeremiah Cole's name had traveled farther than the plaza at 12th and Braxton. It had crossed city lines, reached musicians' groups, news outlets, conservatories, and even international forums dedicated to classical music. What began as a viral street performance had grown into something bigger, a cultural reckoning. Because it wasn't just that Jerry had played beautifully. It was that Jerry had once been great and forgotten. And now he had returned. By Saturday, a full crowd formed before noon, not for a performance, but to witness the presence of a living mystery. The plaza had become something sacred. Families brought lawn chairs. Musicians brought their own instruments, hoping he might speak to them. Cameramen hovered at the edges like they were shooting a documentary. Still, Jerry remained unchanged. He sat in the same squeaky plastic chair, the same green windbreaker, still had the same stack of lottery tickets displayed beside him, only now, people took them as keepsakes, not chances. Blake sat beside him more often now. At first, just to listen, but eventually to learn. What was it like? Blake asked one morning. Back then? When you were at the top? Jerry sipped from a paper cup of black coffee. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the square, watching the fountain bubble softly in the morning breeze. Like walking a tightrope, he said at last, "All eyes on you, every night. You don't get to trip. You don't get to age. And you definitely don't get to mourn." Blake blinked. "Mourn?" Jerry nodded, his voice quieter now. "I lost my wife and daughter in a car crash. Winter of '97. They were coming back from one of my shows in Seattle. I was supposed to be in the car too, but the concert ran late, and I stayed for the reception." Blake's breath caught in his chest. "I blamed the music," Jerry said. "So I left it. I walked out of the recording contract, the orchestra, the teaching gigs. I sold everything, moved from couch to shelter to street. You just disappeared," Blake whispered. "I didn't disappear," Jerry said. "I just became invisible." The words struck deep, because Blake now understood something that fame chasers and feed scrollers rarely grasped. Some people don't want applause. They just want peace. Later that afternoon, a woman stepped through the crowd and approached Jerry with a strange mix of disbelief and reverence. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp navy coat, with an NPR tote slung over her shoulder. In her hands was a worn-out vinyl record, its corners frayed but the label still intact. San Francisco Philharmonic, the Jerusalem Suite, 1992, featuring Jeremiah Cole. She held it out like an offering. "I've kept this for over 30 years, she said, her voice tight with emotion. "When I was 12, I snuck into a theater with my brother to see you perform. We didn't have tickets. Just sat in the aisle and prayed we wouldn't get caught. You played a solo during the third movement. I cried the whole way home." Jerry touched the album cover, his fingers trailing over the version of himself embossed in the center, young, strong, proud. "That boy is gone," he said quietly. "No," the woman replied. "That boy just found his way home." By the following day, news outlets had started publishing retrospectives. "The lost violinist who taught us to listen again. Jeremiah Cole, from Carnegie Hall to a park bench, and back to our hearts. How one man silenced a city with a single note." Old footage surfaced online, grainy VHS uploads of Jerry conducting student orchestras, soloing with world-class quartets, smiling in black and white photographs alongside giants of classical music. The contrast was jarring. The Jerry they saw now, weathered, soft-spoken, humble, was a world away from the vibrant man in tuxedos, commanding concert halls. But the eyes were the same. So was the soul behind the strings. The real question wasn't what happened to him. The question was, why did we let someone like that vanish in the first place? At a press event hosted by the city council 2 days later, where Jerry had been invited, reluctantly, to speak, a young violinist from the local arts academy stood up and asked, "Mr. Cole, why didn't you come back sooner? Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Jerry looked at her with something between patience and pain. "I didn't want to be known for who I was," he said. "I wanted to be seen for who I still am." The auditorium went quiet. And then applause, not the thunderous, performative kind, but soft, sustained, emotional. That evening, something changed again. Jerry didn't go to his plastic chair. Instead, he walked to the plaza's center, and stood in silence. Someone handed him a violin, not Blake's, not a brand name, just a simple instrument that had been donated by a local music store. He raised it to his shoulder. No words, just music. He played, not to impress, but to connect. No showmanship, no grand finales. Just melody after melody, drifting like stories between buildings, rising like prayers in the dusk. People sat on the concrete. They cried without hiding it. Some closed their eyes and leaned on strangers. For the first time in years, a public square had become a sanctuary. And as Jerry played, the fountain behind him trickled in rhythm. Streetlights came on without fanfare, and children danced in soft spirals near his feet, not knowing why they danced, only that it felt right to move while something beautiful was alive in the air. When he stopped, Jerry turned to the crowd and said, "You don't need to know my name. Just remember the sound." But it was too late for that, because the city remembered everything now, and his name, Jeremiah Cole, would never be forgotten again. Some wounds never truly close. Jeremiah Cole had learned that the hard way. He had tried everything to forget. Years of wandering, nights in shelter beds, the silence of subway stations and soup kitchens. He had survived by shrinking himself, folding his life into the smallest possible footprint so it wouldn't hurt so much when someone stepped on it. But no matter how far he ran from music, it had always followed him. In the rustle of leaves, in the whistle of passing trains, in the clatter of coins dropped onto his lap by strangers. And now, at 63, with weathered hands and a face mapped by loss, it was following him again. Only this time, he wasn't running. This time, he was listening. It had been a week since Jerry played at the center of the plaza and changed everything. Since then, the square had become something else entirely. No longer just a commuter pass-through or a backdrop for selfies. It was a meeting place, a breathing space, a stage for the kind of art that didn't need applause to be powerful. Every evening, just before sunset, Jerry would return, not as a performer, but as a keeper of peace. He didn't always play. Sometimes he just sat in silence, the violin resting across his knees like a memory he was finally ready to carry without breaking. People came not to demand songs, but to sit beside him, to share, to grieve, to breathe. One woman, a retired nurse, brought her late husband's favorite book and read passages aloud near his bench. A teenager sat cross-legged with his own cello, gently playing scales he had been too embarrassed to practice before. A man in a pinstripe suit came every Wednesday at 5:15 and just sat without speaking, until, one day, he whispered, "My father used to play too." Jerry would nod. Sometimes he would offer a word, sometimes just a quiet look. But always, there was presence. Until one Thursday evening, something unexpected happened. A van rolled up along the far edge of the plaza. Out stepped a group of kids, maybe a dozen, ranging from ages 9 to 16. All in mismatched clothes, sneakers too big or too tight, some carrying second-hand instrument cases held together with duct tape. They were from the Northside Community Center. Most had never had a real music lesson. But after seeing Jerry's video online, one of their volunteers, a woman named Carla, had written him a letter, never expecting an answer. Jerry had written back. He invited them to the plaza. When they arrived, there was no stage, no lights, no sound crew. Just Jerry, standing by the fountain, violin in hand. "Sit in a circle," he said. They did. He handed out small notebooks and pencils. Asked their names. Asked what they were afraid of. Asked what they remembered hearing the last time they felt safe. Then he said, "Now close your eyes and listen to that memory." He didn't teach them notes. He taught them how to hear themselves. By the end of the first session, none of them had played a song. But they had all played one thing: honesty. The next day, the kids returned, with more friends. The following week, a music teacher from a charter school nearby asked if she could bring her students. Within 2 weeks, Jerry had an unofficial orchestra, dozens of kids, many from neighborhoods that had no music programs, some from homes that had no music at all. And suddenly, the man who had once vanished from the world stage had become something more than a comeback story. He had become a mentor, a lighthouse, a legacy reborn not in spotlights, but in little fingers learning to play C major. Blake helped organize the sessions. Jade brought old sheet music and boxes of donated rosin and shoulder rests. A local violin maker came by and offered to repair any broken instruments, for free. "Just don't let him fade again," the man said, nodding toward Jerry. One evening, as Jerry stood behind a young girl carefully drawing her bow across the strings, Carla approached him quietly. "You know," she said, "I think you're healing them." Jerry gave a tired smile. "Maybe." She looked at him, hesitated. "But are they healing you?" The question hung there like smoke. He didn't answer. But that night, for the first time in nearly 30 years, Jerry pulled a small wooden box from his closet, the last remaining thing from his old life. Inside was a faded photograph. Him on stage at Carnegie Hall, his wife Angela in the front row, clapping with both hands high, his daughter Mia standing beside her in a little red dress, beaming with pride. He stared at it for a long time. Then he wept, not because he was sad, but because the pain had finally moved. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But it was no longer stuck inside his chest like a shard of glass. It was moving, through bowstrings, through young hands, through stories whispered in the dark. And when Jerry wiped his face dry, he realized something. Music hadn't healed him, but it had given him a way to live with the hurt, to let it sing instead of scream, to let it teach instead of torture, and most of all, to let it go. Jerry had always believed that silence was safer than sound. For decades, it was his armor. In the months after the accident, he couldn't even walk past a concert hall without feeling like his ribcage might collapse. The world had kept moving, applauding, recording, but he had stood still, watching it all with eyes full of ghosts. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the applause from strangers. It wasn't the camera phones or the journalists. It was something smaller, deeper, something he saw in the eyes of the kids who came back every day to sit around him, violins too big for their shoulders, breathing too fast, fingers unsure. He saw hunger in them, but not for fame, for belonging, for guidance, for someone to tell them that they mattered, even if no one at home did, that they were worth being heard, even when the world made them feel invisible, the kind of hunger Jerry himself once had. And so, he started coming earlier. He would arrive at the plaza before sunrise, sweeping leaves into a corner with a borrowed broom, organizing folding chairs into circles, tuning donated violins, rosining old bows until they could hum again. He never called it a school. He never charged a cent. But it became something far more than a class. It became a resurrection. One Monday, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus asked him, "Mr. Cole, is it true you once played for the president?" Jerry smiled faintly. "Which one?" Marcus's jaw dropped. Later that week, a shy girl named Layla, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in front of anyone, played a three-note phrase Jerry had taught her. It squeaked. It wobbled. But when she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes and said, "That felt like flying." Jerry just nodded and whispered, "That's what it's supposed to feel like." Another day, a mother came to the plaza with her son, a boy on the spectrum who had been unable to sit still in a classroom for more than 5 minutes. But when he held the violin for the first time, something remarkable happened. His hands stopped shaking. Jerry didn't react with surprise. He only said, "Music doesn't judge. It waits." Word kept spreading. Soon, local music teachers began volunteering on weekends. A retired conductor offered to donate a baby grand piano. The city council passed a motion to preserve the plaza as a cultural landmark. They even discussed building a small, open-air music pavilion. At the center, a bronze plaque would bear the name, Jeremiah Cole Sound Circle. Jerry resisted at first. "I'm not a statue," he grumbled to Blake one evening. "No, you're something better," Blake replied. "You're still alive to hear them play." That hit harder than expected, because Jerry had come to believe that his legacy would be a shadow, a name on an old program, a ghost in someone else's career. But now, as he watched a new generation of musicians rise from sidewalks and shelters, he realized something radical. He didn't have to disappear to leave something behind. He could still give. He could still build. He could still live. One evening, as the sky bled into gold and indigo, Jerry brought out a violin that had been sitting in his apartment untouched for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't just any violin. It was Angela's gift, the one she bought him for their 10th anniversary. Custom made by a luthier in Cremona, Italy. Rosewood back, ebony pegs, and a signature carved into the scroll. "Let your sound be the truth." He hadn't touched it since the funeral. But that night, he opened the case and laid the violin across his lap. His hands trembled, not from fear, but reverence. He turned to his students. "I want you all to remember something," he said. "Music is not your escape. It's your mirror. It won't save you, but it will show you who you are. A beat. And if you're brave enough to listen, it will never lie to you. Then he lifted the violin to his chin and played, not a solo, not a showpiece. Just a simple lullaby his wife used to hum while rocking their daughter to sleep. Soft, gentle, circular. And as the children listened, sitting cross-legged with wide eyes and open hearts, they weren't hearing a lesson. They were hearing a man forgive himself. When the final note faded, nobody clapped. They simply sat in stillness, letting the sound settle in their bones. Layla, the girl who had only ever played 3 notes, whispered, "That was for her, wasn't it?" Jerry's eyes glistened. He nodded once. "Yes, baby, that was for her." And for the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel broken playing that melody. He felt whole. It had been 51 days since Jeremiah Cole first drew a bow across Blake's violin and stopped a city in its tracks. 51 days since a man the world had dismissed as a nobody played a single note that rewrote every story people had told themselves about who matters and why. And now, the plaza had changed completely. Once a place of background noise and hurried footsteps, it had become a kind of urban cathedral, where truth echoed not in sermons, but in strings. The city had relearned how to pause, to listen, to stay. A local muralist had painted Jerry's silhouette across the wall of the community center facing the plaza. It wasn't a portrait, just a figure holding a violin beneath a rising sun. Next to it, in white brush strokes, he played to remember, so we would never forget. By now, everyone knew his name. But more importantly, they knew why it mattered. Not because of the symphonies he had performed, not because of the halls he once graced, but because of the way he came back from silence and showed others how to do the same. Blake now helped Jerry run weekly community sessions. Jade had launched a fundraiser to sponsor instruments for kids who couldn't afford them. Jerry's Fund, it was called. Over $30,000 had been raised in 3 weeks. Every afternoon, kids arrived at the plaza with instrument cases slung over their shoulders, lunch bags under their arms, and nervous excitement in their steps. They called Jerry Maestro, Mr. C, or simply Coach. And every time, he greeted them not like students, but like keepers of a flame. He never talked about fame. He never talked about the past. He talked about breath, about listening, about playing as if your story depended on it. Because for him, it always had. One afternoon, as a breeze danced through the plaza and children tuned their instruments, a woman approached Jerry with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Melinda Evans, a former first-chair violinist who had once played under Jerry's baton during his guest appearance with the Cleveland Chamber Ensemble in 1990. "I was 21. You taught me to close my eyes and let go of the notes. It changed my playing forever," she said. Jerry chuckled. "I probably said that because I forgot the sheet music." She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "You saved my career." He looked away, eyes soft. "No," he replied. "I'm just now learning how to save my own." That evening, the city held a surprise ceremony. It wasn't hosted at City Hall or a red carpet gala. It was held right there, in the plaza, under lanterns strung between the trees, in the middle of the sound circle. Dozens of chairs were set up, folding tables filled with donated food, a small stage built with plywood and old choir risers. Jerry didn't know what was happening when he was called to the front. He stood in his windbreaker, violin case in one hand, blinking under the soft glow of hanging lights. The mayor stepped forward. "Mr. Jeremiah Cole," she began, "for your contribution to this city, not just as a musician, but as a healer, a teacher, and a voice that reminded us who we are, it is my honor to declare this space officially renamed." She turned and pointed to the fountain behind her. A new plaque gleamed under the spotlight. Jeremiah Cole Sound Circle, a place to listen, learn, and belong. The crowd stood, not just in respect, but in recognition. They weren't applauding a man who had returned to glory. They were honoring a man who had redefined it. Jerry stepped forward to the mic. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, violin at his side, eyes scanning the crowd, children, elders, musicians, skeptics, believers. Then he said, "I thought silence was the only way to survive. That losing what I loved meant I had to lose myself, too. I ran for music because it reminded me of who I used to be and who I failed to protect." A long pause. But what I didn't understand was this. Music doesn't just remember. It forgives. He turned to face the young orchestra. Blake behind the cello section, Layla holding her now-polished violin, Marcus fiddling with his bow tie, trying to look grown. He smiled. And these kids, they didn't just learn how to play. They taught me how to begin again. A hush fell. Jerry stepped back, lifted his violin. No fanfare, no crescendo, just a few simple notes. A melody he'd written the night before, in the quiet of his small apartment, with nothing but an old metronome ticking beside him. It was soft that it was warm that it felt like sunrise after a long, frozen winter. And when he played, something incredible happened. The children began to join him. One by one, their bows rose. They didn't play in perfect unison. Some came in late. Some missed notes. But they followed. They listened. They belonged. And Jerry smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was enough. Because this time, the man who had spent his whole life trying to prove his worth to the world was finally playing for the only audience that mattered, his own soul. And in that plaza, under the lights and the trees and the wide-open sky, a man who once walked away from music, from fame, from love became the kind of legend that didn't need a stage. Because Jeremiah Cole was no longer trying to be seen, he was showing others how to see themselves. And this time, the music would never stop again. Sometimes, the most powerful music isn't heard on the grandest stages, but in the quietest corners, played by those the world has forgotten. Jeremiah Cole reminded us that brokenness doesn't disqualify you from greatness, it deepens it. That silence is not the end of a song, but the pause before a new movement begins. He didn't come back to reclaim fame. He came back to teach us how to listen. To ourselves. To others. To what still aches and needs healing. And maybe, just maybe what we carry in silence could be the sound someone else is waiting to hear. Thank you for walking with us through this powerful story. If it moved you, made you pause, or reminded you of something you've been carrying silently, please take a moment to reflect and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us tell stories that matter, stories that breathe, stories that heal. Leave a comment below. What part of Jerry's journey touched you the most? Like if you believe everyone deserves to be seen. Subscribe to join us on more unforgettable journeys, and tap the bell so you never miss the next story, because some stories don't just entertain, they change us. Thank you for listening.